She shouted across my backyard on Veterans Day morning, clipboard in hand, neighbors watching, calling my family fence unauthorized land use. Names: Otis Traymore. Retired surveyor. Lived here since the smell of pine meant recess and not lawsuits. Didn't raise my voice. Just ran my thumb over the cracked seal of a 1992 deed one that had been pinned inside my barn for decades. Ever seen someone try to erase your history and hand you the pen to write it back? It was just past 7 when I heard the gravel crunch beneath polished soles. I hadn't even finished my first mug of coffee. The pine needles were still damp, sunlight slanting low through the trees, and the air smelled like creosote and cut grass. I just stepped onto the back porch when I saw them 3 silhouettes approaching the far edge of my property like surveyors invading sacred ground. Marva Donaldson led the charge. You could tell by the way her heels hit the ground like punctuation marks. Her gray suit jacket was pressed sharp lips thinner than usual, and her hair was coiled into a severe bun that glinted with one of those HOA-issued pins, Redbud Estates gilded in faux brass. She stopped right at the cedar post where my fence began and folded her arms. "This barrier," she said, as if addressing a courtroom, "is not within the permitted property lines of your residence, Mr. Traymore." I didn't answer immediately. I took a sip of coffee slow and steady and glanced past her at the 2 people flanking her. One was a lanky kid with a ballpoint pen tucked behind his ear and a clipboard held like a shield. The other a woman with a camera dangling from her neck, already snapping angled shots of my fence like it was a crime scene. Marva narrowed her eyes. "The HOA reviewed satellite overlays last week. This wooden structure cuts directly into the designated buffer zone that belongs to Redbud Estates' future community green space." She didn't even look at the sign nailed to the fence, a hand-painted plank I'd sealed in marine varnish years ago. The words carved in my grandfather's shaky letters had faded just enough to show age, but not defeat Traymore family line, since 1956. She pointed at it. "That doesn't mean anything here." I didn't flinch, just shifted my weight and said, "That fence has been there since I was 5. That may be, but your timeline doesn't override recorded plats. The HOA will issue a formal removal notice within 72 hours. You're encroaching, Mr. Traymore." She pronounced it like a warning. Not a conversation, not even a negotiation. I could feel the corner of my mouth twitch. Not a smile, but not anger either. Just something that bubbled up when someone tried to act like they had all the pieces of a puzzle they didn't know was missing a box top. I took one slow step forward until the line between our properties, if you could call it that, lay at our feet. "This isn't your land, Mrs. Donaldson. It's never been your land. This fence marks where my grandfather planted honeysuckle long before your HOA was even a blueprint. The HOA bylaws supersede outdated private claims that were never formally recorded with the county assessor. Your nostalgia doesn't hold legal weight." That last word landed like a gavel. She meant it to. The boy scribbled something on his form. I stared at her for a beat longer, then turned back toward my porch. "Be seeing you," she said over her shoulder, and then came the part she had saved no doubt just for drama. "You're trespassing, Mr. Traymore." She said it loud enough for Garrett Slocum, my neighbor, to hear from across his lawn. Loud enough that I heard his lawnmower stop mid-pass. I didn't respond, didn't look back. I let the screen door creak open and shut behind me. By the time their footsteps faded down the gravel drive, the coffee in my mug had gone lukewarm. I stood still in my kitchen, looking out the window over the sink where the reflection of that fence flickered in the glass. My grandfather built that fence with hickory boards he hand-sawed and sealed in turpentine. I remembered holding nails in my palm for him one by one as he hammered under a summer sun that made his shoulders shine like copper. I rinsed the cup, dried my hands on the same dish towel I'd used since I retired, and walked out the side door toward the barn. The barn sat low, weather-beaten, and stubborn, just like I liked it. The padlock still clicked open like it remembered my fingers. Inside it smelled of hay and rusted oil cans. Dust hung in the light like tiny memories. There was a chest tucked under a tarp, wood-faded gray with age. Burned into the side in neat block letters were the initials R.T. Reuben Traymore. My grandfather. I pulled the tarp off and unlatched the metal fasteners. The hinges groaned. Inside were old survey tools, a leather-bound ledger with his sketch maps, and wrapped in wax paper, a crinkled photocopy of a deed. I unfolded it slowly. The edges had curled. The ink had faded in places, but the date still held filed March 22, 1992. Name of owner, Reuben E. Traymore. Property description, Tract 4, Parcel 17A. Bound east by Lake Edge, south by County Line Road, west by Oak Fence Post Row, Stamped faintly at the bottom was the mark I remembered like a childhood ghost Sabine Parish clerk's office. Blue ink almost gone. I held the paper up toward the barn's dusty window. The sunlight hit the crease just right, revealing the ghost of my grandfather's signature. His loops, once bold, had softened, but they were still there, etched in a style no HOA charter could overwrite. I ran my thumb across that name. Not because I needed to, but because it felt like reaching backward through time. "We'll see about that, Grandpa," I murmured. And suddenly, the next 72 hours felt like a countdown. Not to remove a fence, but to defend a line drawn long before Marva Donaldson ever walked in heels across my gravel. The envelope came on a Thursday afternoon, slipped between a gas bill and a flyer for gutter cleaning. Certified. Return address, Red Bud Estates Compliance Office. The kind of envelope that hums with smug authority even before you open it. I stood by the mailbox at the end of my drive, looking down at the oil-smudged corner of the envelope. Just enough stain to make it feel handled, passed around, maybe even fingerprinted with intent. You could almost smell the sweat of someone eager to twist this paper into pressure. I didn't open it right away. I walked it back up to the house like it was loaded. Inside, it was exactly what I expected, only worse. Official language wrapped around threats with a silk ribbon of legalese. Unauthorized structure, non-compliant with Redbud Estates. Visual buffer ordinance subject to removal at owner's expense within 14 calendar days. There was a grainy printed photo of my fence attached, shot at an angle that made it look jagged and villainous. I laid the letter flat on my kitchen table and stared at it, the words crawling like insects across the white. Then I folded it neatly, slid it into a folder labeled HOA Stuff, and set that on top of the hutch like I was building a case I hoped I'd never need. But hope's not a plan. That evening, just before dusk, I walked the property line with my measuring wheel and the survey stakes my grandfather had sunk decades ago, metal-tipped and deep. I checked them before, but this time I logged coordinates on my notepad. The fence hadn't moved. The land hadn't shifted. What had changed was the nerve of people convinced a committee entitled them to rewrite land lines. I set up 2 trail cameras, one on the pine just past the boathouse, the other tucked under the eaves facing the gravel walk that led toward the HOA development. Motion activated. Night vision. I may not have wanted a fight, but I wasn't about to sleep blind. The next morning, Ellen Ray arrived. 19 years old, pre-law, and sharper than the sunrise she walked in on. She came down for the weekend just to visit, she said, but I knew better. Her mom, my daughter, must have told her what happened. Or maybe she saw the way my name had started showing up on neighborhood forums like I was a rotting tree that needed to be cleared. "Grandpa," she said, standing barefoot in my kitchen flipping through the HOA compliance letter, "this clause is misquoted. Completely." She dropped her bag by the door and pulled out her laptop before I could even pour her coffee. By noon, she'd downloaded the original HOA charter from the parish archive and found 3 inconsistencies between what Marva quoted and what was actually filed. Clause 4.7. The one Marva used to threaten fence removal only applied to new builds after 2017. Our fence, 1956, baby. That afternoon, Garrett Slocum dropped by. Still smelled faintly of diesel and pine tar. He handed me a folded manila envelope. "Found this in my garage," he said. "It's a plat map from the first HOA filing. Look closely, there's no buffer zone drawn between your land and theirs, just your name and a straight line." He winked and left without asking for coffee. Alon spread the map across the table. She and I leaned over it like archaeologists reading a dead king's curse. The boundary line was thick, solid, and silent. Our side, their side, nothing between but arrogance. That night, the wind came in from the lake, making the trees creak and the boathouse groan like an old ship. I sat on the porch with a thermos of black coffee and the trail cam receiver. Nothing for the first hour but raccoons, a skunk, and a brief appearance by what I think was a fox. Then, at 11:47 p.m., 2 figures appeared on the screen, flashlights bobbing, one taller one hunched. They wore Redbud Estates polo shirts and carried clipboards. I leaned forward. They stopped just short of the fence, whispered something. Then the taller one stepped over. The camera's infrared caught him snapping photos of my back windows of my house. I didn't move, just watched the feed. Watched them linger. Then I hit record. The next morning, Ellen and I watched it together. Her jaw clenched. Mine didn't need to. I'd already made up my mind the night before. I opened my laptop, logged into my email, and typed a single message to the HOA address printed on their letterhead. to whom it may concern. Any further communication regarding my property must be directed to my legal counsel. You'll find my fence exactly where it's always been. I suggest you keep your representatives the same. I'll be waiting. Otis Tremor. Then I attached the still image of their guy standing on my land flashlight raised like a thief looking for a light switch. I didn't want to fight, but I wasn't about to fold. And in Zwolle, folks still believe a fence means something. The phone rang just past 6, the kind of early call that only brings bad news or old friends. With Garrett Slocum, it could go either way. They held a meeting, he said, without greeting. HOA. Saturday night. You weren't on the invite list. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Not surprised. Garrett's voice dropped. Marva called you a squatter. Said you're occupying park-designated land that belongs to the Redbud Master Plan. Used those exact words. I sat up straighter. She said that in a meeting. She sure did. Marnie was there. She got something to share. I knew Marnie Jameson back when her knees didn't pop going upstairs. She'd been the HOA secretary for 5 years, ran every budget line like a hawk, and knitted prayer shawls on weekends. But ever since Marva took over, Marnie had started looking less like a board member and more like a hostage. That afternoon, Marnie called and asked to meet behind the church, said she didn't want to be seen pulling into my drive. She handed me her phone and tapped play. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from nerves or age, I couldn't tell. The audio was faint, but clear enough to catch Marva's voice slicing through the background murmurs like a cold front. If Mr. Tremor refuses to remove the fence voluntarily, we'll proceed with reassignment under Compliance Code 8.2. He doesn't have the resources to fight us, we'll force him to comply. Or reassign the land. I paused the recording. She knew it was yours, Marnie whispered. She just wants it gone. I thanked her with a nod, and she walked off quickly, not looking back. A betrayal that quiet takes courage, especially in a town where lawn signs can be louder than sermons. Later that night, I sat on my porch fiddling with the copy of the deed I'd pulled from the barn. Something near the bottom caught my eye, fine print nearly smudged away, certifying surveyor. Clary Venshaw, L.S., Nome, 2376. Clary, my old mentor. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years, not since his wife passed and he'd sold the last of his gear to a museum in Baton Rouge. But if there was anyone alive who could validate this deed, it was Clary. I called him that evening. His voice still carried that riverbed drawl, half whiskey, half wisdom. You up for breakfast tomorrow? I asked. Only if it's greasy, he said. I don't trust clean grits. We met at the Zwolle Diner the next morning, where the linoleum tiles were cracked but familiar and the coffee tasted like memory. The air smelled of pork links, tobacco ghosts, and something cinnamon sweet from the back kitchen. Clary shuffled in with a cane, nodding toward the booth like he still owned the place. I slid the folded deed across the table. He adjusted his glasses, took one look, and smiled. Lord, I stamped this with a manual press, he said. You know how long it's been since I used that thing. His finger traced the faint blue ink. Back when Sabine Parish still used carbon triplicates. Your granddad brought me 3 peach pies for doing the survey. Said he didn't trust anyone who worked for free. I laughed. Sounds like him? He tapped the paper. This is real, not a copy shop fake. I remember drawing this boundary line myself. Told Reuben to drive cedar posts along the north edge. Bet they're still there. They are? Clary nodded, satisfied. Then you're not squatting, Otis. You're standing. A waitress with a name tag reading Iona brought our plates. Eggs, sausage grits slick with butter, and refilled our mugs with chicory brew darker than Judgment Day. We ate in easy silence for a while, the kind that only exists between 2 men who've shared backroads and busted compasses. When I mentioned the HOA meeting and Marva's reassignment line, Clary's eyes hardened. This ain't about rules, son, he said, his voice low and grave. It's about someone thinking they can rewrite memory. You fence off a piece of land long enough, it stops being dirt. It starts being legacy. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather notebook. I've still got copies of my survey logs from 91 to 95. I'll pull the page on track 17A. We'll shut this down with numbers, not noise. I nodded. Community meetings next Friday. They're calling it a property compliance hearing. He smirked. Sounds fancy for a public shaming. I left a 20 under the salt shaker and stood to go. As I reached the door, my phone buzzed. From Redbud Estates, HOA. Subject notice of mandatory appearance, compliance hearing. The date matched what Clary and I had just discussed. The subject line pulsed like a dare. I looked back once through the diner window. Clary was still sitting there, coffee cup spinning slowly in his hand, staring at the deed like it held more than ink. Maybe it did. Ellen Ray slammed the porch door so hard the screen jumped in its frame. "Grandpa," I looked up from the bundle of tax parcels spread across my coffee table, heart knocking twice before I recognized the urgency on her face wasn't fear, it was victory. She held her laptop high like it was the 10 Commandments. Clause 229. "Listen to this. Grandfathered land is exempt from retroactive buffer application. It's right there in the Redbud HOA charter plain as daylight." She turned the screen toward me, and sure enough, there it was. Bold text nestled deep in a section no one ever read unless they were either being sued or doing the suing. I let out a low whistle. "They really tried to bury that one." "Exactly," she said, dropping into the recliner with a triumphant thump, "but they didn't count on a pre-law granddaughter with caffeine issues." Her grin faded a bit as she looked around the room. My living room had become a paper battlefield. Plat maps hung over the back of chairs, folded deeds lined the fireplace, and a tangle of survey stakes rested like bayonets by the window. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in the long slashes, throwing everything into sharp relief. "Clary's fax should be in by now," I muttered, walking over to the fax machine humming softly near the hutch. I pulled the freshly printed pages from the tray. 3 sheets. Black and white, but still alive with purpose. The top one bore his letterhead dated and initialed. The second was the 1992 certified topo map, clean, elegant, annotated in Clary's meticulous hand. And the third was his signed statement, boundary of 17A, verified via direct survey on record confirmed against 2022 GPS benchmarks. No discrepancy noted. I laid the map out across the coffee table and weighted the corners with mugs and salt shakers. Ellen Ray joined me on the floor, her hair falling in front of her face as she examined the tiny compass rose and hand-drawn elevation lines. "Look here," I said, pointing to the lower corner. "That's the oak." The one out back, I nodded. "Still standing. See those 2 roots at the base? Like a wishbone." She pushed the curtain aside and peeked through the window, then smiled. "Still exactly like that. That's how you know a man surveyed with truth in mind," I said, voice softening. We compared the topo's annotations with the GPS logs from last week. North stake check, eastern run within 6 inches, fence line perfect match. No buffer, no encroachment. Just history. "Want to read my hearing statement?" I asked. "Definitely." I handed her a yellow notepad 3 pages long scrawled in ballpoint. "Ladies and gentlemen of the HOA, I'm Otis Tremor. My family's lived on this land since 1956. The fence in question has stood since before some of your houses were foundations. The deed I hold was certified in 1992, verified again last week. I have not violated the law, nor have I disrespected your governance, but I will not stand for being labeled a trespasser on my own bloodline." She looked up at me, eyes glinting with pride. "It's good," she said, "measured, firm. No anger, but no apology either." I nodded. "That's the tone I'm after." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before leaning forward. "I'm bringing the camera." I blinked. The camera, the one I used in my media law course, HD, tripod, shotgun mic. If they try to railroad you at this hearing, people will see it. No editing. Just truth. I hesitated. Might make things worse, or it might make them behave. She said, smoothing out the fax paper with a tenderness that caught me off guard. I sat back, letting the late afternoon light bathe the table. The topo map shimmered slightly in the warmth. I picked up an old pen, the kind with a brass clip and a name etched on the side, R.T. Tremor. My grandfather's. I traced his signature at the bottom of the deed Clary had faxed. The ink was faint, but there. It curved like a wind-bent pine, unmistakably his. My hand shook a little as I followed each letter, not because I was scared, because memory has a weight, and when you carry it long enough, even a page can feel like a stone. Behind me, the oak rustled in the evening breeze, its branches brushing the roof like fingers saying, "Steady now." I turned back to Ellen Ray. "Let's get everything packed. Maps. Statement. Coordinates." She nodded, already building a folder on her desktop labeled HOA Hearing. Truth. Outside, the light deepened into gold. Inside, history was preparing to speak. By the time I stepped through the glass doors of Zwolle Town Hall, every folding chair was taken. Some neighbors stood along the wall, arms crossed, faces drawn tight like the strings of a mandolin. The hum of overhead fluorescence buzzed in my ears as I scanned the crowd. Projected across the front wall was a digital rendering of Marva Donaldson's proposed community greenway, a sweeping lawn, picnic benches, decorative gravel paths, and at the center, a clean-cut lawn where my fence currently stood, a hypothetical Eden scrubbed clean of memory. She stood at the podium spine, straight blazer, sharper than her voice. And so the buffer zone once restored will unify the common areas and promote equity among residents. I paused near the entrance. Clary sat in the back row, tapping his cane once against the tile. Just once. Our old signal from job sites, I see you. I've got your back. I nodded. To my left, Ellen Ray adjusted the camera mounted on a small tripod. The red light blinked steady. She wasn't here for drama, she was here for documentation. Marva kept speaking, her tone growing firmer with each slide click. This fence is a violation of common space continuity. It creates a visual barrier inconsistent with the Redbud Estates master plan. On the screen behind her, a photo of my weathered fence filled the wall. They'd caught it in harsh afternoon light shadows, making it look older than it was, grayer broken alien. Then she smiled. That kind of smile that carries more than conviction, it carries intent. The land was never meant to be private. A murmur rippled through the room. I stepped forward. No words, just the sound of my boots on tile. Marva turned, lips tightening. I carried no notes, no binder, just a manila folder and a small folded paper soft from being handled too many times. I reached the front table, unfolded the 1992 deed onto the surface. A moment passed like a held breath. Then I spoke. This is a certified deed issued November 3, 1992. Surveyed, signed, and sealed. I stepped aside so others could see. Ellen Ray projected the scan onto the wall beside Marva's Greenway map. The projector's fan hissed, filling the sudden hush. A few residents leaned forward. There's more, I said quietly, tapping the margin. Sketch of the oak tree still growing root for root just beyond the fence line. Gasps flickered like wind through dry grass. I moved to the next slide, Clause 2.2.9 from the HOA's own charter. Ellen Ray had highlighted it in yellow. Grandfathered land shall not be reclassified post-1995. I read aloud, slow and steady. This deed predates your bylaws. Then I turned to the crowd. This isn't about a fence. It's about memory. About what's been stood upon, built upon, believed in for generations. Silence followed. Then Clary rose from the back. No one asked him to. No one needed to. He hobbled to the front, eyes locked on the deed. He ran a weathered finger over the seal, then looked out across the room. This is my signature, he said. And that document is legal. I surveyed this land with Reuben Tremor in the fall of '92. Drove stakes myself. He paused. And that fence has stood longer than this HOA's bylaws, longer than that projector's been in this hall, longer than some of your houses have had their second coats of paint. The room held its breath. Marva straightened her papers. Her voice, when it came, was thinner than before. These documents, they'll be reviewed by district planning. But she didn't look anyone in the eye. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the remote. A rustle moved through the crowd. Not loud, not angry, but present. People were shifting, not against her, but away from her. That subtle retreat when a leader missteps and reveals it wasn't a march, it was a solo parade. I said nothing else. Ellen Ray shut off the projector. The silence returned. I gathered the deed carefully, folding it like cloth. The seal caught the overhead light and gleamed just a flicker, a burnished flash of gold. As I turned to leave, someone clapped. Just once, then again. A few more followed. Clary put a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't win just now," he whispered. "You reminded them they weren't always in charge." Outside, the night had deepened into a cool November hush. A wind brushed through the pines along the road, steady and unafraid. At the entrance of the Sabine Parish District Office, a young staffer holding a clipboard looked up from the front steps. He leaned toward a colleague and whispered just loud enough for it to catch the wind. "Is that the guy with the oak tree map?" I didn't smile. Just dipped my head once in acknowledgement and kept walking. The building smelled like floor wax and recycled air. Long, pale corridors stretched in both directions, lined with glass partitions and gray chairs where half-dozing citizens clutched forms like they were raffle tickets. Clary Venshaw walked beside me, slow but steady, the topo map rolled beneath his arm like a sacred scroll. His breath came with effort, but he didn't complain. We checked in and were led to a chamber lined with wooden benches and beige acoustic tiles. The fluorescent light did no one any favors. Marva Donaldson was already seated, tight-blazered as ever, flanked by a man with a silver tie and an expensive briefcase. Her eyes didn't meet mine. The lawyer looked me over like I was an old tax code. I took my seat at the adjacent table, set down a single folder, and waited. The commissioners entered, 5 in total, middle-aged and older, with legal pads and water cups, and the weary dignity of people who'd sat through too many zoning appeals. The chairperson, a gray-haired woman with half-moon glasses and a voice like polished gravel, opened proceedings. Today's hearing concerns a boundary dispute between Redbud Estates HOA and Mr. Otis Tremor regarding Parcel 17A. We'll begin with the complainant. Marva's lawyer stood. His voice was well-trained, precise, sterile. The HOA contends that the fence in question interrupts designated common space as laid out in the 2005 Greenway Expansion Plan. While the deed Mr. Tremor presents as dated prior public use utility takes legal precedence under local zoning provisions. Our position is that... I tuned out the rest. It was the same argument we'd faced in town hall, only wrapped in more Latin. When it was my turn, I stood not tall, not loud, but steady. I unfolded the 1992 deed again, the same one that had stood through storms and accusations. Clary laid the topo map beside it, rolling it open with a reverence that silenced the room. "We're not here on emotion," I said. "We're here on record." Clary nodded toward the map. This was drawn with analog tools, not pixels. Each point recorded by chain and sight. You'll see the north marker aligns with parish survey coordinates from 92. These boundary points haven't moved. The fence hasn't moved. Only the claims have. He read aloud the numbers northings and eastings, each one landing like a gavel on the table. The room stayed quiet except for the faint sound of a pen tapping. Marva's lawyer. Tap, tap, tap. I waited for him to interrupt. He didn't. Then I lifted a single sheet, the printed copy of Clause 2.9 from the Redbud Estates Charter. Grandfathered land is exempt from retroactive buffer application. I passed it to the commissioners. This clause was voted in by the HOA themselves in 2006. My land has been taxed as private since 1992. I slid over my property tax statements from the past 3 decades, each one filed on time, each one clear as sunrise. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses and scanned the papers. Then she looked to Clary. "And you certify the accuracy of this map?" "I do," he said. With the weight of 40 years under my belt and a cane I didn't need back then. She nodded once, then looked to me. "We've heard enough." The room held its breath. She turned to her fellow commissioners, lips moving in brief, quiet consultation. Then she leaned into the microphone. "Ownership is confirmed. The HOA acted beyond its jurisdiction. Redbud's proposal is denied." It was not shouted. It did not spark applause. It simply settled, like a dropped stone into a pond ripple, then stillness. Marva inhaled sharply. The lawyer reached for his briefcase with the twitch of a man who already knew this was over. She stood, but her eyes never rose from the table. Clary didn't smile. Neither did I. Some truths don't make you triumphant. They make you whole. We gathered our things and walked out in silence. The receptionist offered us a polite nod. The young staffer by the door looked at the map again, eyes lingering on the sketched oak like it held something he didn't quite understand. As we stepped outside, the mid-November air met us with pine and coming frost. I stopped at the sidewalk and looked left at a small new sign freshly posted outside the commission building. Public Comment Session. HOA Reforms. December 4th. I nodded once, then turned to Clary. "You hungry?" He smiled, just barely. "If you're buying." The front page of the Sabine Sentinel landed on my porch with a thud louder than usual. I bent down, picked it up, and there it was, black and white, 3 columns wide. No sensationalism, just fact. Fence, rights, case. Spurs, HOA, policy, review. I stood there for a while, still in my flannel coffee, cooling in my hand, reading the words twice. Not because I couldn't believe them, but because I wanted to soak in how quietly change had started. Later that morning at Pete's Cafe off Main Street, I walked into the scent of buttered biscuits and chicory. The hum of conversation dulled just slightly as I passed. Not in the cold way it once did, but in a new, curious one. People had begun to look at me a little differently, not as a man stirring trouble, but maybe as someone who'd done what they wished they'd had the guts to. By the community bulletin board near the restroom, someone had pinned up a blown-up copy of the deed. The 1992 was underlined in bright yellow highlighter, behind plexiglass no less. I didn't ask who had done it. I just stood for a second and looked at it like I was seeing an old friend wearing a medal he never asked for. Elon Ray met me there holding 2 paper cups. "I've got the projector booked for Wednesday," she said, eyes gleaming. "Town Library. Seminar title, Know Your Deed. I chuckled. Catchy. She sipped. It's not just us anymore. Garrett's coming, and the Bransfields, they think they've been wrongly fined for years. I went through the bylaws again. It's a mess. Across the room, Garrett Slocum walked in holding a stack of printed plat maps under one arm and a box of powdered donuts under the other. He winked at me. Payment for past sins, he said, raising the box. The three of us found a booth near the window, and what followed was less a meeting and more a planning session with laughter tucked between citations. 5 other residents had reached out to Ellen. All had similar stories, sudden letters, vague fines, veiled threats. But now, thanks to one old fence and a deed few believed in at first, the tide was shifting. That afternoon, we visited the public library. In the small community room with green carpet and mismatched chairs, Ellen set up her laptop. Garrett spread out the maps, and I sat in the back watching it all. When the projector clicked on Ellen's first slide read, Land is History. Know Yours. A couple in their 30s, soft-spoken and nervous, raised their hands. The woman said, We used your case, Mr. Tremor. The HOA tried to fine us for landscaping near our fence, said it was outside the line. We showed them your clause 2.2.9 and they backed off. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and said, Glad it helped. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something else, like soil settling after a storm. The following week, a small note appeared in the HOA newsletter wedged between an announcement for the fall chili cook-off and a reminder about leaf-raking President Marva Donaldson has submitted her resignation. An interim board will be formed pending community nominations. No grand speech, no apology, just quiet withdrawal. Later that evening, I walked home the long way past the church-the-school lot and finally past my own fence. The shadows stretched long across the pine needle lawn, just like they had the day Marva first stood on this same line and called it trespass. The fence was untouched. Still there, still mine. But, as I walked closer, I noticed something at its base. The first slats on the western end were starting to rot. A patch of soft wood had given in to the seasons. Funny, I thought. Not everything that stands the test of time does so unscathed. I leaned on the post and traced a hand along the grain. It held. Ellen Ray stood in the morning sun holding the new plank like it was something sacred. The wood was fresh-cut cedar edges sanded smooth, the letters etched by hand, Tremor family line, since 1956. Reuben Tremor's land. I reached for it carefully as if afraid I'd smudge the words. The grain shimmered in the light, and for a moment I thought I saw my grandfather's knuckles guiding the carving chisel. We walked to the fence line together. The old sign, weathered and gray, still hung, but now with a coat of sealant and a new bracket. I mounted the new plank just beneath it. Not to replace, just to echo louder. The oak tree nearby stirred in a light breeze, and flakes of white paint fell from the pickets like little slips of memory. Down the hill near the border where the grass met gravel, 2 kids raced their bikes, laughing tires skimming the strip that had once been a battleground. Now it was marked clearly by small flags and a bronze survey peg Elon and I had hammered in ourselves. One of the boys glanced over and waved. I waved back. By 10 o'clock we were at the community hall. The town had agreed to host a monthly session called Land and Legacy Part Workshop, Part Gathering. Elon led the front laptop-ready projector already humming. The first slide read, Reading Your Deed, How to Know What You Own. 15 folding chairs. 14 were filled. Folders, manila envelopes, worn plat maps from the 1970s and 80s lay scattered across the tables. One woman clutched a ledger that looked older than I was. A man asked if he could bring his grandson next time. I didn't speak first. I waited until questions faded until Ellen nodded at me and said, Go ahead, Grandpa. So I stood not to make a speech but just to share. About fences and oak trees. About knowing where your line is and having the grace to defend it without turning into a barricade yourself. I told them about Clause 2.2.9 and the day Marva left without another word. I didn't win anything I said. I just reminded some folks that memory counts even when it's not in the minutes. Someone clapped, then someone else, and then we all just kind of sat there quiet like we understood something had settled. After the session, Ellen pulled a thick envelope from her tote bag and handed it to me. Came in yesterday. Inside was a letter from Clary Venshaw. His handwriting shaky but still sharp read, I'm proud this old map found its way back home. I never thought that oak would outlive us all, but I'm glad it did. It still holds the truth. He enclosed a small photo, him and Reuben Tremor in 1992, standing in front of the barn. Both wore caps, both squinting, both holding survey poles like spears. That night back home, I placed the letter and the certified deed in a frame, hung it near the kitchen. Beside the door, I tacked a printed flyer for the next Land and Legacy meeting. Alon had already added a subtitle in bold, "Stand where they stood. Know what you keep." The next morning, I found myself standing by the fence again, coffee in hand, warm light pooling across the lawn. The sapling Ellen planted last fall had taken root beside the oak. Its leaves were just coming in a soft green against bark, not yet rough. A teenage boy and his younger sister came walking up the road, backpacks swinging. They paused at the fence, looked at the new plank. The boy ran his finger along the groove of the name, Reuben Tremor, and turned toward me. Was he your dad? I thought for a moment, looking at the name then, at the boy's face open, curious, respectful. No, I said softly. He was better. He was the man who taught me how to draw lines and stand behind them. The wind kicked up, rustling the trees. The sapling bent slightly but held firm. And for the first time in a long while, I stepped away from the fence not to defend it, but to walk forward. The scent of cedar lingered on my fingers as I tightened the last screw into the new sign. Beneath the oak, where children now traced names instead of boundaries, the land felt quieter, settled. Sometimes we defend a fence not to keep others out, but to remember who built it and why. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with noise. It comes with paper patience and a promise kept. Even when the boards begin to rot, what they stood for can hold. Has a quiet truth ever changed your life more than a loud argument? Share your story below, or just let someone know theirs mattered.